Okay, I'm back. So it's just past 6. I'm going to give us a couple minutes for people that are just joining us now to have an opportunity to take a look at this question that I posed just to get our conversation started tonight. And it's really just about reflecting on Course 2 and what insights may have emerged for you, for your students, for your teaching, or just for schooling in general. Okay. And this is helpful both for feedback from me and also just to kind of get a sense of where people are at this point in the full year-long course. Mm-hmm. And if you've written already, I suggest you do what I'm doing right now, which is to read your peers' entries. I find it actually really nice to hear how people are taking things up. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Alexandra, I get that. Mm-hmm. Kate, I agree. Strategies are always something in these courses that are kind of an unexpected benefit of being in a community of other teachers in the courses, that when we give you all an opportunity to share with each other, quite often what you know and can share with colleagues is much more valuable than anything someone else could provide you with from the outside. Mm-hmm. We'll take about 2 more minutes till 6:05, and then we'll start talking, okay? Hi. Tracy, I'll wait for you to finish and then we'll start talking. I see that you said have an also, but now I'm wondering also what. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So if you're still, oh, thank you, Veronica. Okay. So that Veronica's last idea about raising an awareness of higher order cognition at play in the classroom and language demands in the classroom, in and of itself is, in my experience, kind of a useful outcome as a teacher in terms of developing a lens for understanding the potential underlying causes of students' difficulty and challenge in the classroom, and also supporting and challenging students in a more thoughtful way. Veronica, can I assume that you mean more thoughtful in that you're challenging them to extend higher order thinking in particular ways, or you're challenging them to elaborate in using their expressive language in particular ways. Can you speak to that a bit? You can either chat it, or you're welcome to pop on the phone if you'd like to do that as well. It's up to you. And for everyone else, I'm going to guess Veronica's writing. I just put up here the kind of ideas I saw represented in your responses today. And so this one idea that I think of a lot, especially with the transition to Common Core, is that this idea of what's a good lesson is typically a lesson that heavily demands higher order thinking. And there's a lot of benefits to that potentially for students' development of critical lenses and problem solving and 21st century skills and all this kind of stuff. And without a recognition of the other constructs that are placed in demand because of that, for example, language, but also the very specific facets of higher order thinking, there's a lot of places and moments and sites where students can get themselves into difficulty and or can be challenged by the task itself. So like a great lesson might actually end up marginalizing a fair number of students in the class if the demands on higher order cognition are not attended to, and or if the implications of involving the other constructs back into content areas where students were perhaps potentially previously getting some relief from those demands on language and higher order cognition, those opportunities are kind of lost in the transition to Common Core. Mathematics is a perfect example of that. So that's a content area that many teachers even went into for the purpose of not having to deal with, encounter, and work with as much language as you would typically see in a history of social science or an English class or something like that. With the new standards and the new approaches to preparing for the tests and the new kinds of questions that are being asked of students, there's tons of language in math classrooms, and a lot of the students are unprepared for how to work with that and handle that and express their mathematical thinking through words, but teachers are often unprepared for that as well, and it's been an inelegant transition in a lot of settings for that exact reason. Here, Veronica looks like yeah, so Veronica says, exactly, just being more aware of where my students are as far as higher order cognition and language. Yep, enable me to get to know my students more. Great. And this has helped me realize which students could use or handle more of a challenge and which students need more support in a social and an academic sense. Perfect lead-in to what we're going to be talking about a bit today and what week 6 is focused on in the course, which is some ideas around differentiation as well. So with these themes that I pulled out, so that's what where Veronica was coming from, is that awareness really kind of gives her insight into the kids themselves. Mindy, you're saying, I still think many students experience finding traditional methods success now. It's entirely possible, yeah, Yeah, so what Mindy's saying is that with the procedural emphasis in mathematics prior to Common Core, a lot of kids were kind of left behind because they were lacking access to the concepts that might have actually tied the procedures together in meaningful ways for them. And I agree with that. Yes, so there's always expected consequences and unexpected consequences of changes. So I think that the Common Core standards were largely designed to address not just those kids that weren't able to follow the procedural approaches, but also just kind of internationally understood teaching practices that conceptual understanding of mathematics underlies accurate calculations and supports students as they get into higher grades. At the same time, with the policy shift in the United States and the demands, the associated assessment materials and curricular materials, the demands immediately that students are able to articulate their math thinking, it has been a bumpy ride. And a lot of the teachers, especially younger teachers that were educated themselves in a more procedural way due to the prior policies, there's a lot of learning that needs to go on back there, and that's kind of what I meant by that. I personally think there's a huge amount of value in organizing teaching around the Common Core standards with that depth of thinking as really featured. And I think it's important when we're doing that to attend to what that actually looks like on the ground and what that means for kids who are struggling with language, either due to a language weakness in and of itself or due to language status and knowledge of English in and of itself. With limitations on language knowledge, then there's an acquisition and access to speaking English fluently. Then there's compromised moments in mathematics that are new and weren't there before. That's kind of where I'm coming from. Okay, great. So personally, I consider the insights that at least are listed here, job well done, guys, yes. In terms of my goals for your learning in the course, the idea of really looking closely at what it is a lesson is asking of students, not what the learning objective claims the lesson is asking of students, but what the tasks themselves demand of students. That lens is an extremely powerful piece to take from course 2, this kind of module, but also this year-long course in the neurodevelopmental framework, is that understanding not just kids in terms of the strengths and weaknesses that they represent in a learner profile across the constructs, but really unpacking and attending closely to the demands embedded within the lesson. So even a lesson that's designed for problem solving, we now know has these language demands embedded. It also will have things like social cognition demands embedded that are really not featured typically, but hugely important if you're working with kids in the classroom. So those kinds of lenses is a crucial aspect of this work. So I'm very pleased to see that idea represented. The second bullet point, this one about strategies for supporting students, I kind of touched on, I mentioned this a couple minutes ago, but that you all as a community of educators currently working with students in the classroom right now, bring with you a wealth of knowledge that is important and valuable. And so I'm pleased to see that people are gaining strategies, either just from the readings and materials that we present you with this course, but hopefully also from the other participants in the course. I think that matters a lot. And we talked about it in week 4 at our last session. I was learning from the resources that all of you were sharing as well. So please keep up that practice in future courses. The next idea about language interactions with higher order cognition, attention, and memory, yes. All of the constructs, we've been over this, and I know Erin talked to you about this, but these constructs constantly interact and intersect and build upon each other and sometimes contradict or place contradictory demands on kids. And so staying aware of that is really important too. And then the power of student learning profiles in terms of students themselves knowing about their learning and their strengths and areas of challenge is crucial. So great, really nice work. Okay, so it's our last night together until course 4. So I'll be back and see you then in, I think it's March. But for tonight until 2017, this is just our last time. So there's a few things I want to talk to you about in terms of differentiation. But before we do that, I was curious, I just want to make sure, in part because it is week 6. So there's one announcement I want to make, and I will likely send out a message as well, but I'll make it now, and then I want to check in. So the announcement is I am asking that all materials for the course are submitted. I'm going to give you a few extra days. I know it's a hectic time for a lot of people. I've gotten some messages from people in the course about some extenuating circumstances that have challenged you this fall. And because of that, I want to give you a couple extra days to finish this stuff before I need to start grading everything and submitting grades. So Wednesday night at midnight, a week from today, is when I will begin looking at all of the assignments that you set in. You're welcome. And I won't consider anything late that comes in as of Wednesday at midnight. If you know that you have assignments that are going to come in after Wednesday at midnight, my request to you and my suggestion to you is to contact me and tell me. I believe the grades will be due just before the holiday, and or it's possible they'll be due between Christmas and New Year's. So there's a little bit of play in there for when I can accept things, but I wouldn't want to kind of shut the door when you're still intending to submit something. Once it's late, I'll take off a little bit. I'll take off some points, but don't be overly concerned about that. But I will take it off just to be equitable to your peers that are trying to get things in on time. Okay. So Wednesday, next Wednesday, midnight, not Sunday, at the end of week 6. Good? Okay. So questions, does anyone have questions either about, you should all have feedback from part 2 on your learning activity assignment that I sent you this weekend. And moving forward, I just want to make sure that we feel all set, all good. If you have a question about the assignment or anything related to it, I would bet that you're not alone with that question. Let's just give people a second, see if you have anything. No? Okay. All right, so if something comes up while we're talking, just ask me. So, oh, and then the other thing is, can I assume that all of you received a message from Amy Hanratty about the course evaluation? Yes, good. Okay, fill it in. Great, fill it in, fill it in, fill it in. That's an easy, I don't know, it's like 10 points or something. We put it into the syllabus, but highly encourage you to make sure to fill it back. We take your feedback seriously. I do want you to know that as well. All of the instructors meet periodically, and we talk about how the course is going, and we use your feedback to make decisions and inform our practice moving forward, which is a differentiated technique as well. And so it matters to hear your voice, and if your voice is not represented but your peers is, then I wouldn't want that to kind of sway what our interpretation is of how the course is going for people. Okay, all right. So I'm going to move us on to some content now, and like I said, just pipe in if you have any other questions. So what I'd like to show you is something, I don't know, actually let me ask you this. How many people have watched Craig Pullman's video for this week and or looked at any of the materials? If you haven't, it's fine. I just want to know, I don't want to speak redundantly. Okay, so video yes, yes, and if you say no, that's totally fine. Okay. So I'm going to get the sense that many people have watched the video, but that for the most part, people haven't kind of gone through all of the materials in a very formal way, for example, these. And I did notice people hadn't filled in the discussion form yet, so that's totally fine. And that just tells me kind of where we're at. So I want to give you a heads up. It's not a shift to a different topic this week, but the purpose of this week is for you to really think about taking action in the classroom based on what we've started to think about and talk about in terms of language and higher order cognition. But with this in mind, these Common Core lessons place really high demands on higher order thinking. And higher order thinking in classroom tasks typically places really high demands on language as well. Well, what to do for the kids that are struggling with language and or the kids that are struggling with higher order cognition itself. And so this week, as we start to move into the idea of concluding this course, we want to make sure that we are offering ideas and strategies for what you can do in the classroom. And so your learning activity project part 3 is one opportunity for you to think about that in terms of designing a scaffold or strategy to support or extend a student's participation in terms of language or higher order thinking. And the other way to think about it is to start really giving some close attention to the ways differentiated instruction can work in concert with the neurodevelopmental framework. And so this notion is something that I'll talk to you about today. Not sure the extent to which Erin will address it like in a very direct way, or Phyllis will address it in a very direct way in their next course. We will talk about it again in course 4. But a kind of big theme of how I've used this work with teachers and in my own classroom over the last many years is to use neurodevelopment and the constructs themselves as information and a way to make decisions for differentiating tasks and activities for students. So I find that differentiated instruction and the neurodevelopmental framework that we're presenting to you with work in a very lovely way together, very beautifully, but they inform each other mutually, and build each other up. So before I talk much more about that, I would love a quick check-in. How many people are familiar with it? I mean, I'm sure we've heard the term differentiated instruction, but how many people are like, how can I ask this in a yes/no way? How many people use differentiated techniques in your teaching right now? Typically, so if you're like, I use differentiated techniques, maybe on a scale. How about okay, UDL, thank you, Mindy. And differentiation, yes, thank you. Nina, yes, okay, perfect. You have to. Well, you mean you have to, Kate, like all teachers should, or you have to like at your school? I supervise student teachers and spend a lot of time in classrooms, and I find sadly I agree with you that all teachers should. I don't see it all happening. Little guys need it, yeah. Okay, great. So you guys are familiar then with these like process, product, content, kind of big ideas and differentiated. Okay. So Nina, I love that you thought all teachers did. I mean, I think that I think K2 teachers, and I think actually elementary teachers, in my personal anecdotal experience, are more used to doing differentiated kinds of strategies and techniques because the needs present themselves so glaringly. Like a child can't read. One person can read, the person sitting next to them cannot read, and therefore something's got to happen during this lesson to make it accessible for everyone. When kids get to be older and they've started to develop these techniques of kind of getting by, it can be more difficult for teachers to see the need to differentiate, and then I think there's often less practice in secondary classrooms as well. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, so I think that said, I've seen some really amazing differentiated approaches from secondary teachers, so I certainly don't want to marginalize them in our conversation, but I do notice that elementary teachers are often used to it. I also think there's something that is distinct between elementary and secondary school that matters for differentiation, and that is that typically in an elementary setting, the kids are with the same teacher all day, right? Whereas in secondary, the kids change classes, and so teachers have many more kids. Because differentiated instruction relies so heavily on a strong knowledge of students and a very strong understanding of their particular strengths and areas of challenge, I think that in an elementary classroom, there's more opportunity to observe students in a variety of kinds of activities that is not something that is available to secondary teachers. So I always try and keep that in mind, because I think that there's a lot to be gained from seeing a student like, I know this person is really struggling with expressive language, but look what happens when we do science. It's a game change. A secondary English teacher doesn't have that opportunity. Yeah, and they have a lot of kids. So just something to keep in mind. It doesn't mean, in the spirit of differentiation, you could still differentiate at secondary level and do it beautifully and well, but I think that it's a different set of challenges. Okay, so what I wanted to show you, though, is that in this week, the reason I kind of wanted to give you a heads up, the reason we pivot slightly to differentiated instruction from the constructs exclusively themselves is that with what you've now learned about the facets and nuances and intersections between language as a construct and higher order thinking, now when we start to think about ways to differentiate in the classroom, I encourage you to use those constructs as places to go. So what do I mean by that? I pulled up this graphic that is pretty cool. I'm reading Mindy's comment, exactly. The reason those high school teachers need that support is they can't do it on their own. Oh, good, VK, you must have been somewhere good. So let me give you guys a little differentiation resource if you're not familiar with it already. This website is called differentiationcentral.com. It comes out of University of Virginia, the Curry School of Education, and that is where Carol Tomlinson is, who's kind of like the, guru, oracle of differentiated instruction. And they do a lot of really, they do a lot of really interesting and wonderful work down there. And this website, but actually I'll back up and just kind of show you where this came from before I go to the tool. They just changed it, like the look of it. But it's they have a lot of really interesting videos and tools and strategies and theory and research and all this kind of stuff that I encourage you all on your own time to just browse through and check out for fun. And what I pulled here is this graphic that I have visited and revisited on this website many times. I find it really interesting, and I want to make it so you can all see it. Move me down here. And it's a flow chart of differentiation. Because you all are already familiar with it, I'm not going to kind of discuss why we need differentiated instruction, but really the kind of big idea, right, is like, you know, not all kids are different, and therefore instruction for all kids needs to meet the students where they're at. Instruction should be modified to meet student needs rather than students trying to fit themselves into a uniform pattern of learning. So differentiation is about this response to learners, a teacher's response to learners' needs. And so this is the first place that the neurodevelopmental framework has a really nice connection with differentiation, because a learner's needs, you can look at learner's needs as assessed by achievement data. You can look at a learner's needs as assessed by participation in class discussions. You can look at a learner's needs as assessed by your own formative or summative assessments in the classroom, things like that. You could also look at a learner's needs as their neurodevelopmental construct learning profile. So you might have a student, for example, some of the students that you all have identified in parts 1 and 2 of the learning activity project assignment for this course, you could have identified, all right, well, I know that these 3 students have expressive language needs, and these 2 of those 3 students seem to also have huge difficulties with higher order tasks. So you can start to use the framework to identify those needs themselves. It's the first place it comes in. Then we're guided by this mindset and general principles of differentiation, which are not identical to the kind of foundational principles of the neurodevelopmental framework and the work surrounding it, but they're very, very nicely aligned with that. So the idea of having respectful tasks that are challenging to students and accessible to students, that there's a quality curriculum, teaching up, which I'll explain in a second because that's actually my favorite concept lately, that there's flexible grouping that's based on something about that learner's needs, interests, or strengths, that there's continual assessment and close observations of students, and the idea of building community. So in course 1, I'm guessing Erin talked to you about this being strength-based work, right? And so we're looking for student strengths. Yes, okay. We're looking for student strengths so that we can use those as entry points or access points for supporting their areas of weakness. And so that notion is very nicely aligned with the ideas of principles of differentiation that are listed out here. That's a respectful way to support a student. Because a student struggles with language does not mean that person deserves to be shut out from all higher thinking. But it might take some differentiated tasks so that the person can participate. Okay. Does anyone, have you heard the phrase teaching up before? A yes or no help, because I'll explain. Yeah, I hadn't heard it either until I learned about it on this website. Okay, that's why I wanted to check in. This is like a slight tangent for a second, but it's my favorite notion, and there's a video somewhere on this website that's about teaching up. And I believe the person talking's name is Christina Doubet, D-O-U-B-E-T. And basically the idea, what did you say, Kate? What was the phrase? Oh, teaching up. It's right here. It's this box. And what it means is, so typically when teachers are thinking about differentiating for the class, or the way it's explained in this video, I saw that teaching up by Christina Doubet. She said when she was a classroom teacher and she wanted to differentiate, what she would do is she would start in her head and say, all right, well, what's the main learning goal? Like, what's the kind of midline, what I want kids to get in this lesson? And then she would look for ways to differentiate to support the kids who were not able to get to this kind of midline level of learning without additional support. And she would offer activities and strategies and supports for that. And then she would think of the kids who were kind of already above that level, and she'd try and stretch up extension activities. This is a very common approach to teaching that I took when I was in the classroom as well. However, she said a big insight or discovery that she had was about teaching up, which was that instead of starting in the middle and kind of stretching to look at how we, like looking down from the middle and up from the middle, she said she started planning her lessons by thinking about, like, what is it, like, if all the kids in this class got the most out of this lesson that was humanly possible, what would the very tippy top of what I would want people to be thinking about deeply look like? And that she would scaffold everybody from there. So the kids that are close to there don't need a ton of scaffolding. The kids that are like the middle kids need certain scaffolds to be able to reach this really rich thinking, this deep thinking. And then the kids that are struggling more or have significant disabilities or delays in certain areas might need additional supports and or different supports to get them to this place. But that it was really about thinking about everybody being at their kind of most engaged, meaningful learning, as opposed to like middle is okay and we'll push it up or push it down a little bit. Excellent is the starting place. And I just thought that was a really interesting shift of mindset that for me has been powerful. So that's teaching up. And if you want to see a video on it, I recommend you go back on this website when we're off the phone and check it out. Anyway, okay, you like that because thoughts on that? Mindy had one. Mindy says she likes that because it respects everybody's capacities and recognizes that students are complex. Yes. Yes. Right. I like it too. It kind of also, in that like pushback on deficit thinking for kids with disabilities or culturally diverse kids, it really gives everyone this like place that they can be equitably served and kind of pushed to what they can do at their maximum potential. Okay, so those are the mindsets of differentiation. And then the idea of what teachers can, the video, I'll post a link to it when I find it. I'm assuming, is that what you're asking? No problem, I'll find it after. Let me write myself a note. Because I've used that video for lots of stuff because I love it. And they just reorganized this website, so I don't know if maybe it got moved. Let me just note to self. And I'll post it and I'll send you guys a note. Okay. So then we can differentiate through, I'm going to guess that people have mostly, these are the kind of popular dimensions of differentiation that are typically promoted and talked about. So differentiating through content, which may involve reduced or enriched content for students. You might alter that entirely. When I was teaching at Chime and we had kids with learning disabilities and other disabilities in the classroom, there was a lot of modification and differentiation through content manipulation that I did. I would change the numbers we would use in mathematics for kids that were working on place value in a different place than the rest of the class. I have rewritten portions of text on the missions. I have rewritten short stories into abbreviated versions for students. I have located alternative texts that reduce the language and complexity of language for students, things like that. I'm guessing people are familiar with the content. Then there's the process, how students are expected to engage with that content. Are students writing by hand? Are students writing in a computer? Are students dictating? Are students acting something out? Are they doing an artistic representation? Things like that. And then there's the product, which is the idea that's underlying assessment. And those are clearly places that it can be really important to differentiate. There's also these other two that lend themselves nicely to this work in a strengths-based mindset. So content, process, and product can all benefit from thinking about kids in terms of their neurodevelopmental strengths and weaknesses. If you have a kid, I keep using language because that's one of the main constructs, right, in course 2. If you have a kid who's struggling with expressive language, asking them as their product to demonstrate an understanding of the main causes of World War II, asking them to write an essay on that would likely tap into a language weakness and not give you as much assessment information about what that student actually understands about causes of World War II. Asking a student to select from a text from an option of a couple of statements or text might give you more information, because that would reduce demands on expressive language for the student and still give you access to their thinking on the topic. Okay? So I'm assuming that what I'm saying is not new to most people that are here, because these are principles of differentiation. However, the idea of affect, teacher affect, which is really important, and learning environment, or that used to be called norms and routines for participation, are ones that also lend themselves quite nicely to connections with the neurodevelopmental framework. So the idea of a strength-based approach, where a teacher is literally looking for a student's strength even in the face of weakness, really has a lot to do with that teacher's stance towards kids and affect towards students. So the affective dimension of teaching is kind of like well known to be this like subtle and hard to measure but really important feature. What is the emotional connection that you have with the students in the class, and in what way are you positioning the kids as capable, competent, important learners versus people that are in irritation if they don't get it in the first place on these kind of two ends of the spectrum extremes. So if you're thinking about looking for student strengths, it really supports a positive affect with kids. And then there's the idea of a learning environment that is open to neurodiversity and is acknowledging of the distinction among individuals and the lack of value judgment about which of the constructs your strengths lie upon, one being kind of like better or more important than another. It's one thing to say that kid is terrible at writing, and it's another thing to say the student's really struggling with expressive language in a written format. That has a really different message in terms of the student's identity as a learner and as an individual, and it creates a learning environment that can be about supporting people's needs for learning as opposed to kind of putting it on the person for being able to connect with or not being able to connect with the content. So in terms of that kind of layer of the schematic, the framework has a lot of connections as well. And then there's just these kind of, this bottom part. So then as the flowchart goes down to, these are how students are, how teachers are asked to make their choices about differentiation according to students' readiness, interest, and learning profile. So if we just think about learning profile as including the strengths and weaknesses on the 8 constructs, then you can also start to see. So learning profile may have something to do with that student's achievement or prior performance in the class, and it might also have to do with observations that are close that a teacher has made to understand what that person's attention looks like, what that person's strength or weakness in spatial ordering or awareness might be, those kinds of features of cognition. And then finally, the instructional strategies, this is like just ideas for it, and you can gather these ideas anywhere on this website or elsewhere. So I wanted to share that with you because I want to make sure that you're equipped to make those connections for what you're already doing and kind of build up from what you're doing using the neurodevelopmental framework instead of looking at them as kind of separate entities. Are there any questions, comments, issues, pushback, feedback on what I just was talking about with you? I'll give you guys a minute or two. No? Okay, we're good? Good. Big message? Great. Differentiate. Yeah, it's just a way to more powerfully differentiate with knowledge of the construct. Okay, and then the last thing I want to show you, I'm guessing that some of you have looked at the slides for this week, but maybe not all. And even if you have, I didn't do a mini lecture because there were so few slides. But this slide might lose its power a bit without a mini lecture. But I'm going to check if slideshow, you can still see. Oh, yeah. Okay, awesome. So I want to show you these slides and talk about them for just a couple minutes. So take a look at these when you can. And it's this one in particular that I thought would be kind of interesting for us to talk about, and I'm going to ask you guys to chat in some ideas in a moment or two. But so this is the depth of knowledge levels. How many people are familiar with depth of knowledge? I think I'm less so than others, but this schematic and frame, yeah. I wasn't as much, but this work is always kind of emerging. So depth of knowledge is, actually, Mindy, do you want to explain to your peers? You can pop on the phone or you can type it if you prefer. What is this depth of knowledge levels framework about, if you're comfy?
I understand it as the reason why it's in a circle is because it's sort of from the writers, it improves upon Bloom's taxonomy by recognizing that there's not a hierarchy. And so at sometimes like level 4 thinking can be the first thing that comes to your mind. Like you want to, create a painting. Like that's the first type of, thinking that comes to mind. But then, to be able to describe or tell about art history, which might be level 1, is like something that takes time to build. So it's just basically saying like, it's not that level 1 is easier than level 2, which is easier than level 3. It's just that level 4 is the most complex.
Uh-huh. So yeah, so that's what the circle's about. And then that idea of it not being hierarchical, that it's not like you have to accomplish level 1 to be able to engage you, but rather that the levels do indicate increasing levels of complexity, but they're not dependent on the prior levels. And especially with kids that have some kind of disability, language-based, attentional, memory-related, it's really spotty, in my experience, what they're able to think about and engage in with and without support. And so having the circle as opposed to the hierarchy seems to fit unusual thinkers a little better too, which are often the kids that we're really thinking about when we're doing differentiated strategies or when we're using the neurodevelopmental framework. It's usually like with the kids where you're either with the lesson itself, and then also with the kids where you're like, what is going on here? That's where the work is really useful, and that's also where the hierarchical organization of these levels is disrupted, is with those people. So I thought this was an interesting to think of, circle to think about, but also in terms of thinking about ways you could differentiate. So I want to do, if you guys are up for it, let's see how much time we have. Oh my goodness, time's going really fast in here. Let's take like 10 minutes. It won't take that long. But I want to do a little bit of practice to kind of prepare you for a little bit of what you're going to do in part 3 of your lesson plan. And also because these tasks sound simpler than they are. In my experience, I thought it might be nice if we did a little bit of work together. So I want us to imagine a child at, it doesn't have to be at an early grade level, but I know most people in the group are in an early grade level, but it's a few. Imagine a kid who does seem to have a language-based struggle, okay? And so you can think of it either a person from your, in fact, I would suggest, why don't you think of one of the people that you identified in part 1 or part 2 of your learning activity assignment. And then let's just start with level 1. So there's these tasks, and they're listed on the left here. So we have tasks like recalling elements and details of story structure, conducting basic mathematical calculations, labeling locations on a map, representing in words or diagrams a scientific concept, performing procedures, describing the features of a place or people. So if we think about a kid that has a language-based struggle, but we want to give that person access to higher thinking, can anyone think of an example of a kind of strategy or scaffold that would afford that for one of these activities? Can you, and I'm assuming and hoping you can read them. I know they're a little small, but maybe you have the size. But so what I'm asking you to do is just give some thought for a couple minutes. Like let's say you want to think about describing the features of a place or people, but you have a kid that has difficulty with expressive language. Is there a way we can think of as teachers to give that student an opportunity to do that thinking, that higher order thinking of describing something at an early grade level without placing significant demands on expressive language. So take a couple of seconds, chat your ideas out. I just want to see what you guys are coming up with. And then if you need any kind of support or help with that, your peers are here. Okay, so Mindy's thinking about what I would think of as like a modification I might make if I had an inclusive classroom. So perhaps you could provide several images and have the student create a thinking map. So that the images would then replace words in terms of description. Okay, any other ideas? Could you have the student do a comparison and have maybe several pictures and group sort them into more alike and less alike? Oh, look at that, Kate, see? Good, what else? I can make up examples, but you guys are current teachers, not me. So what we're thinking of are ways to bypass language to support higher thinking. So one idea is to have this kind of graphical, like image-based work, and one is also to have kids use those to create their own organization, which is, if we think about, yes, sketch their own representations, yes and no, that would work, exactly. For a student who might, now of course it depends on your kid, right? So if you have a kid that you know likes art or drawing and has an expressive language difficulty, I would go to sketching, personally. If I had a kid who had a fine motor or graphomotor weakness and expressive language difficulty, I would offer picture selection. Does that make sense? So these are the kind of notions of how we can differentiate using the constructs and the principles for higher order thinking. We're teaching up. Let's look at level 2 activities. I'm going to pick one just for fun. So I'm going to read them to you because they're small, or read some of them. Identify and summarize major events in the narrative. Use context cues to identify the meaning of unfamiliar words. Solve routine multi-step problems. Describe cause and effect. Organize, represent, and interpret data. Let's try this top one. How about identifying and summarizing major events in a narrative? So you might have some of the same techniques, and we're going to have some new ones. I have a couple ideas already. So let's say you have a student, and the idea is to identify, so if it's an early grade, let's think about if they were asked to do a retelling, like a sequential retelling of a story and have a significant language difficulty. For an older grade, we might think of summarizing a story, synthesizing it like a, 3-paragraph summary of a short story or a book. What might it look like to differentiate for that student either the content, the process, the product, or how the classroom runs? A flow map, Mindy. So are you saying like in terms of the events of the story? Which also offers that kind of very similar, use a flow map first to chart ideas. Oh, so like a scaffold, Kate, so that then the student actually creates the flow map over to, is that what you mean? Okay, so yeah, so then you can start to build those skills for the student. Exactly. So that has a nice embedded way of teaching us. I'm trying to think about how to, You're trying to think about how to make it less verbal. It's hard. This is why I said it's good for us to think about it together. Taking language out of school is like really difficult. What do you mean the ID part? Oh, identifying the main event. Oh, does anyone have suggestions for Mindy? What could we do to help kids identify main events in stories? Highlighting parts of the story, if it feels like a main event. I mean, we can sometimes just kind of addressing it directly. I find, to be honest, I mean, the students do, yeah, that's what I meant too. That's what I was about to say, is that having the students kind of develop their own perspective and or debate about what are the main features of a story can be really useful. And even though there's language involved in that, there are less demands placed on kids often when they're asked to do social talk as opposed to like the kind of more academic performance-oriented talk. Providing a template to help structure a paragraph would help students struggling with language. Like sentence starters and things like that. You could do a graphical representation that just shows the arc of a story with the kind of problem and resolution and place pictures of events along that. You could disorder it and have students reorder it as a way to do an assessment of understanding anti-past language. Story ribbons. Oh, I don't know what a story ribbon is. Nina, what is that? Is that just me who doesn't know? Will you type it or pop on the phone and tell me? Oh, is that right? Am I the only one who didn't know that? It's like a thinking, like a flow chart is the way I think of it. They sequence it on strip of got it. Yeah, exactly. And so then mixing those is a way that then you can do some assessment of whether or not the student is getting it, and use it and or as a support for retelling. Great. All right, let's do level 3 ones unless anyone has questions. I was hoping you would get to this. What about, So I'm reading the level 3 activities. Support ideas with details and examples. We can do drawing for that one, I'm going to say. Use voice appropriate to the purpose and audience. Now that is an interesting one because that's like a written format of voice, and I'm not convinced that that's something that is fully bypassable in terms of language. It may or may not be. And so that might be a place where if I were the teacher in that classroom, I might choose to differentiate the content a bit for a student who's really struggling with language. Identifying research questions and design investigations for a scientific problem. That's something that may be something kids can accomplish without as much of the language demands, and a scientific model for a complex situation. So let me ask you guys this. If you were a teacher who said, okay, you know what, I'm going to use this, what I know about this student's language weakness, but I want them to engage in this higher task of doing a scientific model. So I'm going to give the materials for building a scientific model to table groups, and I'm going to let them work on that. What kind of demands do you think that kid will run into? The kid with an expressive language problem with a task like that, group work to create a scientific model? Does anyone have thoughts? What kind of difficulties might a student with language-based difficulties run into if they're asked to do a scientific model as a group at their table? Any thoughts? Vocabulary, so being able to describe what that person wants to do. Vocabulary could definitely be something. Sharing their ideas as easily, Kate, which can then start to intersect with social cognition. And writing. It depends on the format. Exactly, Mindy. So that's kind of where I'm getting at too, is that like left unaddressed, what Kate is saying, what Alexandra's saying, and what Nina's saying are the first places my mind goes, right? So left unaddressed, that student with an expressive language issue may have a scientific model in mind, but may not have the vocabulary to describe it, may not have the expressive language skills necessary to either write their ideas down or to speak it to peers, and may not be able to interact appropriately with peers because of the expressive language weakness in ways that allow them to kind of gain that social capital you need to get your ideas forward. So Mindy says, well, it depends on the format. So what could we do to make it possible for that student to participate? Why would it help to vacillate between 4 people and 2 people, Mindy? And or if anyone else has an idea, feel free to write that down too. The question is, what can we do? When there's too many people, the kids can't get words in. Yep. Could we do something also? Yeah, but it's true, you give enough time for them to take turns, partner A and B. You can also start doing really structured group work. So each person's idea, I'm going to come around and I want to see that each person has an idea they can identify that they contributed to this model. I do see this a bit at a time. Sentence starters can help, or a template to fill out. You know, I have done a lot of that too in like poster work with kids when I had in inclusive classrooms. So we had kids with disabilities working in partnership with typically developing and gifted kids as well. And so often I would ask kids to represent their group thinking on a poster or some kind of something we could hang up. And I would almost always make them fill in a template first. There was either just questions about what was going to be on there or even like a mock-up of the item itself so that I could approve it before they could go. And that was partly to slow the group down enough to make so that I could ensure that everybody's voice was being heard. You know, I've done an activity lately too with teachers that does place demands on writing, but I'm wondering if it could be modified nicely for kids. It's Chalk Talk. Have you ever done Chalk Talk? Or heard of it? So Chalk Talk is a way of having a silent discussion that's through writing. And so it'll typically launch with a question like, let's see, you know, who is the character in the story that faced the greatest challenge and why? Okay. And so people participating with Chalk Talk would write on a whiteboard, like write their ideas, and then they can start, it's silent. So if you want to agree with someone, you start kind of like drawing connector lines between ideas. If you disagree, you could draw a line and write a response. A facilitator can come in and kind of circle a few ideas and connect them as a way of framing the discussion moving forward. Techniques like that, I notice among teachers, makes it possible for people who kind of get like talked over a lot to participate more. For students in small groups, techniques like everyone having a role, everyone's ideas, like looking for representation of each person's ideas in the final product. Talking chips that I haven't used a lot, but for some reason it's coming to mind right now, like you have a certain number of times you can talk, things like that can be really helpful, but structuring it, knowing who's in the groups is really kind of what I wanted to get across, the importance of that. Yes, Nina, I'm reading your idea. Exactly. Right. Yeah, and you know, in primary grades, Nina, I would say you can do it too. I've done, because I've taught early grades too, it's like a different level of structure and the jobs themselves are different, right? So it'll be the materials getter, it'll be the note taker you can do even in primary grades. In terms of deciding whose idea it is, they need more structure, often in early grades to kind of negotiate that stuff. Yeah, and that way the kids who struggle with writing can still contribute their ideas. Exactly. So those kinds of techniques, you know, you guys are teachers. This is not that I'm not pretending that in this framework these are like, wow, you never thought of giving kids roles, right? But what I think is powerful about using the neurodevelopmental framework is to use the lens of the constructs to make those choices in the moment, because it's kind of a new way. It's a way of looking at kids that's not just about their academic performance on the tests as they're given, but it really starts to look much more closely at which features of tests are hard for kids or not hard, and where do they really shine, and so where might we then position them as most competent. So if you have a kid that has a graphical motor weakness and their written expressive language is very poor, that might be a person you would use as the articulator if their oral expressive language is strong, in part because they're shut out from full self-expression in written format, and also to support and encourage their participation as full members of the class by drawing on their areas of strength. And that's what I find really fun and playful about using these constructs to make design decisions in teaching. So that, oh wow, I'm about to let you go. So that, in a nutshell, is what you are being asked to do for your part 3 of the final assignment. It is very clear, I hope, in the way the assignment's written, but I'm going to ask you to look at both a student who you identified as having a challenge in language or higher order thinking, and a student you identified as having a strength in language or higher order thinking, and I want you to design or identify. You don't have to make something up unless you feel like it. You can also pull something. But identify the particular strategies you might use to scaffold and support those students for their participation and for their learning. And that's what that last assignment is. And then that's going to be really it for course 6. I mean, sorry, I don't know why I said course 6. For course 2. And then I won't see you again until course 4. It's week 6, that's why I said that. Okay, so are there any final comments or questions I should hear before I let you guys go? Otherwise, don't forget, everything's due by midnight a week from today. So hopefully that gives you all, like, breathe a little bit more deeply. And if you're having difficulty, please, please, please email me directly. I will get right back to you. And if I don't hear from you, I will look forward to reading your work. I hope you have an excellent break. I'm sure it's well earned. And I will see you in 2017. Okay? All right, bye. Thank you. Thanks to all of you.